You were never meant to hear this. In the hills of West Virginia, where the fog clings like fingers to the trees, there's a building that hums at night, not from power lines, but from memory. Screams still echo through stone halls, long after the mouths that made them were silenced. This place didn't just house the insane. It created them. Tucked away behind a facade of brick and steel, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was never about healing. It was about control. Built under the Kirkbride Plan, a blueprint sold as moral architecture, this asylum was part of a system that disguised psychological domination as compassion. From the outside, it was paradise, massive windows, open courtyards, a Victorian dream. But inside was a crucible of silence and sorrow, a laboratory of psychological disassembly. Patients were not admitted. They were buried alive in routine. You didn't need to be mad to enter. Your husband could commit you for hysteria, your father for disobedience, or the state simply because you were poor. Once inside, your name was replaced with a file. Your thoughts questioned. Your beliefs rewritten. Not through medicine, but repetition. 1,000 small cruelties designed not to kill the body, but to erase the self. They didn't need lobotomies yet. The system didn't require scalpels. It required compliance. The architecture was part of the control: long corridors to induce isolation, barred windows to extinguish hope, and daily routines built to break the mind into fragments. This wasn't a hospital. It was a ritual. A ritual of unraveling, funded by the state and sanctified by silence. And here's what they'll never tell you: many who entered this place weren't sick. Not at first, but after weeks, months, years under the weight of psychological warfare, they became what the asylum needed them to be. Silent, broken, forgotten. The real insanity? It wasn't the patients. It was the idea that this place was necessary. Now ask yourself, if a government could build a machine like this once, what machines are they building now? Welcome to the descent. We're just getting started. They told the public the asylum was full of deviants, drunks, lunatics, prostitutes. But I want you to hear this clearly. Many of the first patients admitted to Trans-Allegheny were veterans, soldiers, men broken not by madness but by war. The Civil War had ended, but the battlefield followed them home. In their sleep, in their silence. They called it soldier's heart back then. Today we call it PTSD, but in the 1860s, it was classified as insanity. That's how the manipulation began, not with chains, but with language. A man who refused to speak after battle? Insane. A woman who read too much or questioned her husband's authority? Insane. A child who talked to themselves? Insane. You see, the asylum was never built to cure. It was built to sort. To separate those who didn't fit into society's blueprint. And once inside, the system didn't seek your cooperation, it extracted it. Your silence was treated as rebellion, your anger as proof of guilt, your refusal to conform as a sickness. They had a list. 117 officially accepted reasons for commitment. Listen to some of them. Kicked in the head by a horse. Bad company. Disappointment in love. Seduction. Novel reading. Yes, novel reading, because to read was to imagine. And to imagine was to rebel. That's the psychological warfare most men miss. The war isn't always fought with bombs or blood. Sometimes it's a war against thought itself. Inside those walls, resistance was punished with hydrotherapy, ice baths so cold your teeth cracked, or seclusion chambers where men clawed at brick for days in absolute darkness. They called it treatment. But let me ask you, what were they treating? The mind or the spirit? Understand this: a man broken by force can still resist in his heart. But a man broken by doubt, by the idea that he deserves his suffering, that man is conquered. That's what the asylum mastered. Not the destruction of the body, but the surrender of the soul. And when you control how a man sees himself, you never need to lock the door. Welcome to the architecture of control. We go deeper next. There was one wing in the asylum no one talked about. No maps, no public records, no names etched into plaques. Just whispers, among staff, among patients, and among the few who survived long enough to be released. They called it the ward below. It was never meant for healing. It was for experiments. Not in the Hollywood sense. No mad scientists, no lightning bolts. The truth is much more disturbing, because what they were testing wasn't chemicals, it was control. Imagine being placed in a room with no concept of time, no clocks, no windows, no sunrise or sunset, just the endless hum of artificial silence and your own heartbeat pounding like a war drum. This is what they did. They erased the markers of identity. Time, light, privacy, noise, even sleep. One patient was forced to stare at a blank wall for 72 hours while a metronome ticked in the background. No breaks, no food, just ticking. Another? locked in solitary confinement with recordings of their own voice looped back at them, distorted. Words stretched and reversed until meaning shattered. And the staff, they observed it all, not to stop the suffering, but to record when the patient broke. These weren't treatments. They were triggers. They were finding out how long it took to dissolve a human being from the inside out, to make you question what was real, to turn you against your own thoughts. And when you emerged, if you emerged, you weren't the same. You were more pliable, more suggestible, easier to guide, easier to obey. Sound familiar? What began in the asylum didn't stay there. The methods tested on the mentally ill bled into military interrogations, advertising, media, even public schooling. Control through confusion, authority through instability, obedience through fragmentation. And here's the darkest part: the patients never consented. They weren't subjects, they were sacrifices. But sacrifice to what? To an idea that if you control the mind, the body follows. That if you manipulate the narrative long enough, the truth becomes a relic. And those who seek it, they're labeled insane. This is the forgotten crucible of psychological warfare. And it didn't end, it evolved. Ask yourself, if this was happening in 1864 behind asylum walls, where is it happening now? We're peeling back another layer next. You need to understand something that most men never will. The asylum wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as intended. It was a prototype, a blueprint not just for institutionalization, but for mass conditioning. The walls were physical, yes, but the real prison was built in the mind. Let me show you how. Each morning, patients were awakened by a bell, not an alarm, not a request, a command. The same meals, at the same time, eaten in silence. The same clothing, the same posture, the same daily duties, sweeping empty corridors, folding linens that would never be used. The repetition was not for structure. It was for submission. Every act was a lesson: you have no agency. You exist on permission. Your identity no longer belongs to you. You think that's history. Take a step back and look around. Bell schedules in schools, cubicles in offices, routines designed not for productivity, but for predictability. The system doesn't fear chaos. It manufactures it, just enough to make obedience feel like safety. And then there's the diagnostic language. That's the trap no one sees. In the asylum, they invented terms like moral insanity and female disorder, phrases that pathologized anything inconvenient to power. Today, it's more polished: oppositional defiant disorder, adjustment disorder, non-compliant personality. Understand what this means: if you question too much, too loudly, or too often, you're labeled. Once you're labeled, you're isolated. Once isolated, you're silenced. Once silenced, you're forgotten. Just like the men and women who walked into trans, Allegheny, and were never seen again. You are not watching this by accident. You were pulled here because something inside you doesn't sit right with the world you've been handed. And that inner voice, they tried to erase it back then. They still are. But if you've made it this far, I want you to comment below, twice, the phrase, "I remember the forgotten." I remember the forgotten, not just for engagement, but as a signal to yourself, a rite of passage. Because once you see how deep the programming runs, you don't go back. We go deeper next. Let me take you now to the records room, a place most visitors never see, and most staff were told to avoid. It was hidden beneath the main hall of the Allegheny Asylum, behind a locked iron door that required 2 keys. One held by administration, the other by medical staff. But the truth wasn't just kept behind locks. It was buried in paperwork, rewritten history, deliberate omissions. Inside that room were the black files. Patient records marked with an invisible signature, red ink along the spine. Red meant experimental. It meant do not disclose. It meant forget this person existed. Many of the red spine files contained names that never appeared on any intake list. No next of kin, no release date, just a beginning and silence. But in 1957, a former orderly, his name was scrubbed from public record, leaked one file to a reporter in Pittsburgh. It detailed the treatment of a 34-year-old man committed for persistent questioning of reality. His so-called illness. He was convinced the asylum itself was an experiment in mass obedience. His treatment: isolation, sensory starvation, forced memory regression through sleep deprivation and hallucinogenic compounds that wouldn't be made public for another decade. LSD. That's right. Decades before MKULTRA, they were already playing with mind expansion, not to awaken, but to confuse, to dissolve, to reshape. You see, the asylum didn't just break people. It reprogrammed them. Once a patient reached a certain threshold of mental compliance, they were rewarded with small freedoms: a warm meal, a visit outside, a letter home. But these were not acts of mercy. They were levers. Do what we want, and you get comfort. Disobey, and you disappear. This is operant conditioning, the same technique used in cults, intelligence agencies, and education systems. Reward the obedient, erase the defiant, and the ones they couldn't break, they weren't released. They were reclassified, unfit, untraceable, unreal. Do you see it now? What they started in the asylum was never meant to stay behind walls. It was always meant to scale. Mass psychology, behavioral control, reality as a construct fed to you one dose at a time. If you think this is just about West Virginia, you're still at the surface. Next, we descend further, to the moment where silence became policy. There was a memo, unsigned, unsealed, and supposedly lost in a fire in 1932, but fragments of it survived, smuggled out by a nurse who claimed to have witnessed things that should not exist in a sane world. She died before she could testify. Throat slit in what was ruled a suicide, though no weapon was ever found. But her hidden copy of the memo was recovered decades later, and its contents, terrifyingly familiar, it wasn't written in medical language. It read like a protocol, a set of operational instructions for how to fracture a human being without touch. Here's what it said. Line by chilling line 1. Establish doubt in identity. 2. Control all access to time. 3. Replace natural language with institutional phrasing. 4. Punish independent thought as a risk factor. 5. Introduce symbols of order, uniforms, routines, gates. 6. Reward obedience with brief illusions of freedom. 7. Repeat until self-erasure is achieved. Let that sink in. These weren't suggestions. They were engineering directives. They weren't meant to treat illness. They were designed to manufacture dependence. And here's the kicker: that language, that sterile, surgical voice, would later appear almost verbatim in declassified CA documents from Project RK and MK-YLTRA, operations designed not to extract truth, but to install it, to inject a narrative so deeply into a person's psyche that even they believe it. Do you understand now? The asylum wasn't a facility. It was a furnace. It incinerated reality and forged new minds from the ash. And here's where it gets even darker. In 1949, Trans Allegheny was quietly visited by 4 foreign agents posing as medical researchers. 2 were from Britain, 1 from Germany. The last, unnamed, unrecorded. They didn't observe, they didn't tour. They went straight to the lower wing and stayed there for 7 days. When they left, they carried no files, no boxes. Just a leather case locked to the wrist of the unnamed man. Whatever was in that case was never seen again. But within 6 months, the asylum began operating under new behavioral directives, and 1/3 of the original staff resigned or vanished. You want forbidden knowledge? This is it. Because once you control perception, you no longer need to bury bodies. You just bury the truth. And the truth is clawing its way back. Let's open the next gate. They always said the dead don't talk. But they were wrong. The walls of Trans Allegheny remember, not metaphorically. Literally, in 1973, a structural survey uncovered a sealed sub-basement beneath Wing C. No stairwell led to it. No records acknowledged it. Just an empty cavity buried in the blueprints, filled with thick, wet silence. When they broke through the brick, the workers found etchings, thousands of them, carved into the stone walls by fingernail, broken porcelain, or bone. They weren't drawings. They were names. But not the names of patients. Over and over again, in jagged repetition, like obsessive mantras. Dr. Halloran, Nurse Beatrice, Father Marin, not prayers, curses. And in the far back corner of that chamber, there were 3 words burned into the stone by fire. We were awake. You see, some of the patients weren't broken. They were awakened. They began to see through the veil, the rituals, the fake diagnoses, the psychological crucifixion dressed up as medicine. They saw the asylum for what it was, not a place to treat the mind, but to reshape the soul. So what did they do? They resisted. Not violently. Spiritually. They began to speak in code, to hide messages in nursery rhymes. One of them scrawled on an old sheet still survives. Ring around the orderlies, pockets full of screams. Ashes, ashes. We still dream. This wasn't madness. It was rebellion in disguise. The staff labeled them delusional. But ask yourself, how do you define delusion in a place designed to erase truth? That's the dark genius of it all. The deeper you dug for reality, the more insane you appeared. Gaslighting wasn't invented in a relationship. It was forged in institutions like this, where men were convinced they were broken for seeing clearly. And here's the twist: no one expects the ones who woke up were silenced. Not by force, not by death, but by removal from memory, erased from records, deleted from rosters, family told they never existed. This is the ultimate weapon erasure. Because when no one remembers you, your truth dies with you. Unless someone digs it back up. We just did. And there's something waiting in the next chamber. There's one room in the asylum that even the doctors feared. They called it the Echo Room. It wasn't marked on the official schematics. No door number. No signage. Just a narrow steel entrance buried beneath layers of plastered wall. Only those with certain clearance could enter, and even then most refused to return. Why? Because something happened in that room, not physically, but psychologically. The patients who were brought there didn't leave with scars. They left with silence. A heavy, unnatural kind. The kind you don't recover from. Staff reports, the ones that weren't destroyed, describe the same outcome patients who returned from echo treatment no longer recognized their names. They no longer asked questions. They simply obeyed. Blank stares, frozen smiles, alive but absent. Here's how it worked, according to the scattered notes we've uncovered. The Echo Room was equipped with an early prototype of sound, loop technology, crude by today's standards, but devastatingly effective. They would record the patient's voice during intake. Then, in isolation, they played it back, distorted, twisted, slowed to an inhuman crawl, layered beneath it, sub-audible tones, patterns, whispers that weren't the patient's. Phrases like, "You are not real," "There is no self," "Obedience is peace." This wasn't therapy, it was identity disintegration. The objective wasn't to heal trauma, it was to create blank slates. And when the experiments were successful, the patients were repurposed, moved to quieter jobs in the asylum. Janitors, runners, orderlies. The staff believed they were getting better, but in truth they had become part of the system. Living instruments. Unquestioning enforcers of the very prison that broke them. Now look at the world around you. How many people do you see, every day, who walk without fire in their eyes? Who repeat slogans but ask no questions? Who defend their cages as if they built them themselves? How many echo rooms have been built since? Not with steel and recordings, but with screens, scrolling feeds, endless noise masked as information. You think this is history? No, this is blueprint. And the same pattern repeats, again and again, in governments, media, education, belief. Erase the core, replace the code, turn man into machine. But we're not finished yet. The next secret is buried in the asylum's foundation itself. They built the Allegheny lunatic asylum on land that should have been left untouched. Not for superstitious reasons, but strategic ones. You see, long before the first stone was laid in 1858, that stretch of West Virginia soil was feared by the local Shawnee and Monongahela tribes. They called it the ground where spirits do not sleep. Tribal elders would mark its borders with burnt ash and iron, ancient symbols of containment, not worship. They knew what the land did to the mind, but the government didn't care. In fact, they chose it for that reason. You think it's coincidence? The asylum wasn't just built there. It was anchored to it. When construction began, the foundation stones were quarried directly from the surrounding land. That's where the mistake began. Or the plan, depending on how deep you're willing to go. Workers reported seeing double shadows during the day. Tools went missing and reappeared miles away. 2 men walked off the construction site one evening, never to be seen again. Their boots were found standing upright in the center of the main hall. Just the boots. This wasn't a haunting. This was resonance. The asylum didn't just control minds, it amplified what the land already whispered. Researchers today call it geopathic stress, the idea that certain areas of Earth emit electromagnetic frequencies that can alter brain waves. But the ancients didn't need science to explain it. They just stayed away. The state, however, turned it into an experiment. Here's the forbidden theory passed between only a few psychiatric insiders. The Kirkbride buildings, of which Allegheny is the crown jewel, weren't just designed for airflow and light. They were tuning forks. Architectural instruments aligned with geomagnetic frequencies. Each corridor, each wing, each stone, set at angles meant to contain and redirect psychological energy. Why do you think so many patients developed symptoms after arrival? Why do you think so many staff left broken? Because the building itself was the weapon. They weren't treating illness. They were inducing it. They were feeding the land. And the land was feeding back. The result, a closed system. A loop of suffering that no one could see. Because it wore the mask of medicine. Do you understand now? This wasn't just psychological warfare. It was spiritual architecture. And in the next layer, we follow the ones who tried to shut it down and paid the price. In 1983, a man named Dr. Malcolm Graves walked into Allegheny with the intention of shutting it down. He was no fool, not a conspiracy theorist, not a ghost hunter, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and Department of Health consultant assigned to conduct a full-scale audit of the facility. What he found? He never wrote in any official report, but he left behind 6 cassette tapes, mailed anonymously to his sister a week before his disappearance. Tapes she later turned over to an independent journalist, who died in a house fire 2 days after announcing their release. Only 2 tapes have surfaced, and they are not for the faint of heart. Tape 1T, you hear the hiss of reel to reel, then the voice of Dr. Greaves, shaking but deliberate. He describes a patient, unnamed, gender unknown, who spoke a language no one could identify. Not Latin, not Greek, not anything in human records. And yet every time the patient spoke, metal objects in the room began to vibrate. Even the tape recorder itself began to distort. Dr. Greaves wrote, "This is not schizophrenia. This is a frequency problem. We're not dealing with trauma here. We're dealing with resonance manipulation." Tape 2 is more disturbing. He speaks of a hidden ledger, found behind a false panel in the East Library. A book bound in what he believed was untreated human skin, stamped with coordinates, dates, and a column titled, "Voluntary Entry Confirmed." But here's the horror: all names in the ledger were staff, not patients. Staff. Some had worked for decades, others only a few months. Each name ended with one of 2 marks: looped or vanished. What does that mean? Dr. Greaves theorized that certain individuals weren't just trapped in the system, they were recycled by it. Looped, brought back under new names, new IDs repeating the same behaviors, same roles. Vanished, absorbed completely, no exit, no trace. He began seeing faces he swore he'd already met, only with different names. Janitors who had the same limp, nurses with the same tone, doctors who never blinked. That was his final tape. Dr. Greaves disappeared 3 days later. His hotel room was found empty, his clothes in the closet, keys on the table, the only thing missing, him. No exit, no trace, just like the names in the ledger. So now you have to ask, if the asylum could consume its own creators, what does that make it? And what does that make us, if we keep ignoring it? Next, we go deeper into the bloodline that built it. To understand why Allegheny was built the way it was, you need to know who paid for it. Not the state, not the church, not some well-meaning philanthropist. It was a family, a bloodline with roots that predate the American Constitution. Their name was erased from the official donor records after 1891, but the land deed, the one filed in Weston County, tells a different story. The original financier was Emery Vale, heir to a transatlantic shipping empire with rumored ties to the East India Company, Masonic banking circles, and secret European societies. Who was Emery Vale? A man obsessed with mind control, spiritual possession, and ancient engineering. He traveled to the Middle East in the 1830s, returning with journals filled with sketches of ziggurats, catacombs, and something he called the architecture of obedience. His notes, mostly burned after his death, described structures that didn't just house people, they altered them, bent them, quieted the divine spark in man, and replaced it with something programmable. Now, why would a man like that buy 666 acres of haunted soil in rural West Virginia? Why build an asylum in the shape of a tuning fork, lined with quartz in its foundation and copper beneath its hallways? Because Emery wasn't trying to help the mentally ill. He was trying to replicate something ancient. He believed, and I quote from one of the last surviving pages of his private journal, "There are frequencies beneath sanity, soundscapes no man can survive unless he is emptied first. The asylum is not the weapon. It is the ritual. Let that settle in your bones." Allegheny wasn't just a place. It was a ceremonial chamber, a cathedral for a new priesthood of control. And those committed there were not just patients, they were offerings. It gets darker. Emery's descendants, though their name was scrubbed, kept visiting the asylum long after it became overcrowded and decaying. There are photographs of 3 men in black coats, always watching from the upper balcony during staff gatherings, never speaking, never recorded on payroll, just watching. When the asylum officially closed in 1994, rumors spread that one final ritual took place before its doors were locked. A severing rite, meant to bind what had been summoned so it wouldn't bleed into the world. But something went wrong, because after that night, 6 locals disappeared. No connection, no motive, no remains. And since then, people have reported dreams of halls they've never walked, screams they've never heard, symbols they've never studied but somehow recognize. This family didn't just build a building, they built a mirror. And in the next section, you'll see exactly what it's reflecting back at us. There's a theory buried deep in Black psychology, too dangerous to publish, too forbidden to even name in academic circles. It's called reflexive identity collapse. The idea is simple, terrifying, and utterly real. If you can create a system that mimics reality closely enough, but just slightly wrong, the human mind will attempt to reconcile the difference by erasing its own memory of what was true. Not suddenly, not violently, but incrementally. And that's what trans-allegheny was. A machine for identity erosion through artificial reality loops. They replaced windows with painted ones. Replaced days with routines. Replaced personal names with case numbers. Replaced truth with language soaked in false empathy. But the part they never expected, the part they couldn't control, was what happened to those who woke up inside the loop. Patients began to describe the same recurring phenomenon. A hallway that wasn't on any map, always appearing between 300 and 30:15 a.m. Inside, the sound of static, like dozens of radios playing at once. And a mirror, old, tarnished, covered in medical-grade dust. Those who looked into it didn't see their own reflection. They saw themselves, yes, but strapped to a bed. Mouths sewn shut, eyes wide open, as if watching someone else wear their life. This mirror was eventually located during the demolition prep in 2001. It was hidden behind a false wall in the eastern wing, surrounded by dozens of melted candles and what appeared to be handprints, pressed so hard into the plaster that bone fragments were found embedded in the wall. When tested by a private research firm, the mirror emitted low-frequency vibrations, inaudible to the ear, but measurable on instruments. The pattern, identical to the electrical frequency of the human brain during dream states. This wasn't decoration. It was a tool, a psychic conduit, a false portal, and every patient who reported seeing it died within weeks. Cardiac arrest, stroke, seizure, suicide, brain scans revealed, with a thalamus scarred by patterns that should not exist in natural biology. So let me ask you, how many systems in your own life today feel almost real? How many mirrors have you looked into lately, only to wonder if the reflection is really you? Because once the loop begins, once you accept the false as true, even a little, you don't wake up as yourself. You wake up as what they needed you to be. In the next section, we uncover the final layer, the mass adoption of asylum architecture in your everyday life. You're living inside an asylum, and you don't even know it? Not the crumbling brick kind. Not the haunted hospital on the hill. No, this one was designed for mass adoption, hidden in plain sight. And it began the moment asylum architecture was absorbed into the modern world under a new name: institutional design standards. After the closure of asylums like trans-allegheny, the blueprints weren't discarded, they were repurposed. Take a look around you. Schools, office buildings, malls, government centers. Cold lighting, narrow hallways, repetitive wall colors, ceilings just low enough to suppress, just high enough to disorient, soundproofing that never quite silences, only muffles. All of it comes from the Kirkbride plan, the original 19th century asylum blueprint. Why? Because that design wasn't just functional, it was psychological warfare. The layout was meant to disorient the senses, suppress independent movement, encourage obedience through architecture, every hallway perfectly linear, every corner predictable. No curves, no chaos, no comfort. Trans-allegheny's architect, Thomas Kirkbride, believed that the shape of space could either cure or destroy the mind. But after his death, that theory was twisted. Instead of curing minds, they designed spaces to contain them. Today, you call it open floor plan, you call it minimalist, you call it efficient. But what it really is residual asylum logic, even worse. They introduce sound conditioning, piping in low-volume frequencies into HVAC systems, mimicking the therapeutic white noise once used in patient calming rooms. But when tested, many of these frequencies match theta brainwave states. The very waves your brain enters when it's suggestible, hypnotized, programmable. You wonder why you can't focus at work, why you feel drained in schools, why malls make you anxious. Because you are not free inside these buildings. You are being conditioned, every hour you spend in them, to accept a controlled pattern of existence. No room for chaos. No room for self-expression. Just routines designed to make you forget you were ever anything more. Trans-allegheny didn't die when it was shut down. It metastasized into your schools, your jobs, your airports, your hospitals. You don't need straitjackets when you've designed the walls to tighten themselves around the soul. Coming up next, the lost blueprints for the final asylum. A place never built, but perfectly rendered in one patient's dreams. There was one patient who saw it all before it happened. Her name was Lydia Gable, a 26-year-old music teacher from West Virginia who was admitted to trans-allegheny in 1902 for what the doctors called dormant melancholia. Translation? She cried too much after her husband died in a mining accident. But Lydia wasn't mad. She was listening to something the others had tuned out. In her first week at the asylum, she told attendants she could hear the walls breathing. By the second week, she claimed the hallways whispered her name at night. By the third, she stopped speaking entirely and started drawing. What she drew was not the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It was something else. 32 sketches in total, hidden inside a hollowed-out hymn book she kept under her bed. Each page showed an intricate architectural plan. Not a building she'd seen, but a blueprint of a place that didn't exist yet. Lydia's asylum was circular, like a panopticon, but more advanced. Every room shaped to amplify certain emotions. Corridors designed to make sound travel in loops, creating echoes that never died. Chambers where walls curved in on themselves to simulate paranoia. And at the center, always a room with no doors. She labeled it the heart. In one note, she scribbled, "They are building the final asylum. Not with bricks, but with ideas. It will need no patients, only believers." Doctors dismissed her as paranoid schizophrenic. They burned most of her notes. But one intern, obsessed with her case, smuggled 3 of the blueprints out in a medical satchel. They were discovered in a private auction in 1987. Architects who reviewed them found something deeply unsettling. The floor plans included technologies and materials that hadn't existed in 1902. Fiber optics, polycarbonate lenses, motion-triggered airflow, and most disturbing, one page had a list of future dates: 1994, 2001, 2020, 2025. Next to each, a single-word test. What was Lydia really hearing? What was she mapping? And what exactly did she mean by believers? What if Trans-Allegheny wasn't just a treatment facility, but a prototype? In the next section, the mind lab beneath Ward 6 and the experiments that made patients forget time, language, and their own names. The entrance to Ward 6 was bricked up in 1953. But in 2006, during a privately funded restoration, a contractor noticed a hollow sound behind one of the walls. When they broke through, they discovered a sealed stairwell leading down, far below the foundation of the main building. What they found was not in any architectural blueprint. It wasn't part of the original 1864 construction. This was something else, a steel-reinforced bunker. No windows, no wood, just concrete lead and cold fluorescent lighting. On the doors were stenciled words in fading paint. Section Delta, Mnemonic Recalibration Labs. Inside were 5 rooms, each one stranger than the last. The first room was lined with walls made entirely of mirrors, except none of them reflected your body. Only your eyes. Every movement you made, only your eyes moved in the reflection, as if your body had vanished or something else was watching through you. The second room had no corners, a perfectly curved, dome-like structure. Microphones embedded in the walls recorded every breath. A reel-to-reel tape in the adjacent control room played one patient's voice on repeat. "I am not me. I am not me. I am not meh." The third room had a chair bolted to the floor and a ceiling-mounted projector that displayed nothing but static. 24/7. The static wasn't visual noise. It had embedded subliminal symbols only visible when slowed to 0.03 of a second. One frame showed a diagram of the human brain, with a red circle around the hippocampus. Another, a black triangle over an eye. The fourth room, completely soundproof. But inside, people claimed they could hear laughing, not loud, chilled-like, as if it came from behind the walls, or underneath the floor. Then came the final room. No cameras, no sensors, just a bed, and on the wall, a hand-painted sentence in charcoal. "Once they remove your words, they can rewrite your soul." This wasn't therapy. It was erasure, a reprogramming of identity. And when asylum records were cross-referenced, at least 22 patients discharged from Ward 6 had no family, no names, no fingerprints on file. Just an exit status labeled, "Mnemonic Reset Complete." So where did they go? Who were they before? And why were their bodies never found? In the next section, the hollow file, and the patient who never existed, but somehow signed the discharge forms. The patient's name was listed as Elias Grange. Admitted October 12, 1949. Diagnosis: pathologically silent delusional disorder, age unknown. No birth certificate, no family contact, no fingerprint match in federal records. Yet he stayed at Black Hollow Asylum for 11 years, longer than any patient ever recorded in Ward 6. The records claim he never spoke, never ate, never slept, just stared blankly through anyone who tried to engage him. But here's where it turns dark. In 1960, Black Hollow Asylum reported that Elias had been successfully reset. His final discharge form included a psychiatric sign-off, thumbprint, and a handwritten signature, but none of the staff ever remembered signing it. And when that signature was analyzed by modern handwriting experts in 2011, it matched no known style, human or mechanical. It was as if the letters had been written by someone imitating what handwriting should look like. without understanding language at all. And then, stranger still, 3 days after Elias's discharge, 5 members of the ward staff vanished. Their homes were untouched, cars still parked, breakfast still warm on the stove, gone. But even more disturbing, their employee files were scrubbed clean. No photos, no social security numbers, just one sentence left behind in each personnel folder. Thei just below in 2T Figi no Babu. That same week, an orderly named Julian Mertz, who'd worked the midnight shift, turned in his resignation. He claimed he saw Elias walking the halls at 3:17 a.m. the night before the disappearances. Only Elias had no face, no features, just skin stretched tightly where eyes, mouth, and nose should have been. Julian swore he heard a voice anyway. Not spoken, but inside his head. "I'm not leaving. I've just changed uniforms." Julian was institutionalized 2 months later, in a different facility. His final journal entry simply read, "I still hear him. He's in the walls." The patients are all watching the door, but no one sees it open, because it opens inside. Was Elias real? Or was he the result of years of forced psychological experiments? Or worse, was Elias something they summoned, not admitted? Up next, the sealed baptism room, and the black water that whispered names no one had spoken in decades. The baptism room wasn't listed on any official blueprint of Black Hollow Asylum. Not in 1921, when the institution was founded. Not in 1946, when the entire West Wing was reconstructed after the fire. Not even in 1972, when state inspectors scanned every room for asbestos and lead. And yet it existed, deep beneath the chapel, down a stairwell that no one remembered being built, lay a circular room completely tiled in black stone. No lights, no windows, no altar, just a sunken basin in the center. 7 feet wide, 3 feet deep, full of water so dark it looked like ink. There were no pipes connected to the basin, no drains, no filtration system, and yet, the water was always full, always cold. But here's what chilled even the most hardened orderlies. Anyone who entered the room could hear their name being whispered from the surface of the water. Softly, persistently, over and over. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes it was in a child's voice. Sometimes it was the exact voice of someone they'd loved, or lost, long ago. One nurse, Meredith Doyle, descended into the room on a dare in 1958. She laughed as she approached the basin, mocking the idea of haunted plumbing. Then she stopped. She began crying, not from fear, but grief. She swore the water called her by her childhood nickname, one only her deceased mother had ever used. And then, as others watched from the staircase, she knelt and whispered back, "Yes, I still remember." She leaned in, placed her hand on the surface, and vanished. No splash, no struggle, just gone. The water remained undisturbed. Still, a state investigation followed. No foul play, no trapdoor, no evidence at all, except for a deep burn mark left on the floor where she'd knelt. Circular, the exact size and shape of a human skull. After that day, the baptism room was sealed in concrete. But it didn't matter. By 1963, patients began drawing perfect diagrams of the room, despite never having seen it. One woman painted the basin on her walls in her own blood. Another man carved the phrase, "Dira and Deep, Remember Me," into his forearm. And from that point on, a new phenomenon emerged: sleepwalkers. Patients and staff alike began rising at 300 a.m., all heading toward the sealed chapel basement, hands outstretched, lips moving in silent prayer. And they all repeated one name when questioned: "She's coming. She's already baptized us." The mother of Hollow Light. Was it a mass psychosis? Or something far older and deeper than science could reach? Next, the ward where time stopped, and the hallway that aged people 20 years and 20 seconds. They called it Ward C, but after 1969, nobody called it anything at all. It was buried, not metaphorically, literally entombed behind steel and concrete. Because Ward C, once reserved for incurables, became the site of the most disturbing anomaly Black Hollow ever documented. Time stopped inside, or worse, a time twisted. It began with Dr. Aaron Feld, a new psychiatric resident fresh out of Yale. Bright, rational, a complete skeptic. He volunteered to supervise the difficult cases inside Ward C, mostly catatonic patients, non-verbal schizophrenics, and 2 mute war veterans. Everything seemed normal for precisely 12 days. Then one morning, Dr. Feld stumbled out of Ward C screaming. His beard had grown to his chest. His teeth were yellowed. He'd aged, physically and visibly, over 2 decades in a single night. When security tried to calm him, he clutched their uniforms and shrieked, "She's a lot uptight, sail again, she's my car." He collapsed mid-sentence. His heart gave out. He was only 31. A post-mortem report showed signs of advanced aging: bones brittle with arthritis, liver damage, retinal degeneration. He had the body of a 78-year-old man. The state dispatched investigators. What they found turned their blood cold. Footage from a ceiling-mounted camera, the only one working in Ward C, showed Feld entering room 6 at 10:42 p.m. Then nothing, just static for 19 minutes. When the feed returned, the timestamp read 8:11 a.m. and Feld was crawling out, aged, mumbling, skin mottled with deep bruises like he'd been dragged through decades of physical trauma. But that wasn't the only footage recovered. Labeled Patient 1147 Room 6 was found in the archives. It showed the same room, same angle. But this time a patient sat motionless for over 48 hours. At exactly the 49th hour he stood up, stared into the camera, and spoke clearly. "It's not 1948 anymore, is it? She tricked me. She made me a monument." He smiled and then disintegrated into dust. There was no breeze, no decay, just instantaneous collapse, like a sand sculpture crumbling under invisible weight. Ward C was quarantined immediately, reinforced with lead and steel. But strange reports persisted. Guards who patrolled nearby claimed to hear footsteps pacing in empty rooms. Nurses swore they saw their own reflections age in nearby windows. Eyes hollowing, skin sagging, bones protruding beneath translucent skin. One janitor described hearing laughter from room 6, soft, feminine, and impossibly old, and scratched into the inside of the sealed metal door. They later found this carved sentence: "Time bends for her, not for us." Who is her? Is she real? Or a psychic projection of mass trauma? No one can say. But the concrete walls around Ward C still sweat in winter. They called it the Forgotten Floor, but it was never built to be forgotten. In the original blueprints of Black Hollow Asylum, the facility was designed with 4 floors. But when the state auditors arrived in 1972, only 3 were visible: basement, ground, and first. Yet on multiple occasions, staff swore they had climbed 2 flights of stairs between ground and first. The math never added up, and neither did the memories. One nurse, Ellen Crowley, reported returning from her shift dazed, claiming she'd delivered food to room 312. Only Black Hollow had no room 312, nor any 3rd floor. When pressed, she described the room vividly: frosted glass window, metal bed frame, and the man inside. He wore a burlap mask. Said his name was Simon, said I'd see him again in 8 days. Ellen died 8 days later. Stroke. No known medical history. Her autopsy revealed something chilling: her tongue had bite marks, not her own. The investigation that followed unearthed more disturbing threads. Blueprints from 1931, before the hospital's renovation, clearly detailed a 3rd floor housing experimental patients, specifically rooms for those who claimed prophetic abilities. Room 312 was labeled Cognitive Time Disruptor, High Risk. In other words, a cell for someone who could allegedly see through time. But there was more. That year, a young orderly named Lucas Brent decided to investigate for himself. Late one night, he climbed the main stairwell alone and kept going. 1 flight, then another, then another. 3 flights up, no floor, just an endless gray wall. But the doorknob was there, brass, old-fashioned, slightly warm from the inside. He hesitated, touched it the moment his skin met the metal. A memory hit him, one he'd never lived. He was standing in room 312. The man in the burlap mask was inches from his face, whispering, "They won't believe you, but you'll keep coming back. That's how she wins. That's how we all stay here." Lucas screamed, pulled his hand away, and tumbled down the stairs. Broke his arm. Suffered a minor concussion. When they reviewed the security footage, it froze exactly as he touched the doorknob, and resumed only when he hit the bottom landing. Every attempt to return yielded nothing. No door, no knob. Just a blank wall, smooth, cold, seamless. But here's the worst part. A week later, a photo was found inside an unused patient file. It showed the original hallway of the 3rd floor, room 312 at the far end, and in the center of the frame, clear as day, Lucas Brent, wearing the same clothes he'd worn the night he claimed to go up. The photo was dated 1935. It happened on a night when the air was too still. The wind had stopped, the animals were quiet, and across the small town of Gallows Edge, every television, yes, even the broken ones, turned on by themselves. It was exactly 20:13 a.m. No signal. Just static. Until a sound broke through. "This is Black Hollow Asylum. We are still here?" That voice, it wasn't human. It was slow, like a needle dragging across bone. Layered, distorted, as though many were speaking in unison from inside a deep cave. Then came the images. First, the halls of Black Hollow, pristine, clean, and full of patients walking backwards, eyes glowing white. Then, room 312, a man in a burlap mask sat in a chair facing the camera. His hands didn't move, his body didn't breathe, but his eyes, visible through the torn fabric, watched every viewer, as if he could see into every living room, as if he was memorizing your face. He whispered, "You left us behind. You tried to seal the door, But the stories, they're keys. And you keep telling them. Then the screen flashed once, black, then white. Then names began scrolling down like end credits. But these weren't the names of actors. They were names of people from the town. People who hadn't been born yet. School teachers, librarians, even children born within the last year. And near the very bottom, 3 final names lingered longer than the rest: Lucas Brent, Ellen Crowley, you. The final image was a bird's eye view of Gallows Edge, except it was in ruins. Buildings crumbled, the asylum overgrown. But in the center stood room 312, perfectly intact, lights on. Then the broadcast cut to black. Phones didn't work for the next 6 minutes. All clocks stopped at 2013. And in the sky above town, residents swore they saw a second moon. A week later, someone broke into the asylum and found an old, dust-covered television in the collapsed East Wing. It was still on, still glowing, still repeating that message: "This is Black Hollow Asylum. We are still here. So are you." And that, dear viewer, is how the darkness endures, not in shadows, but in stories we can't stop telling.